The glass flew before anyone could blink. It was not empty. It was full of sweet tea, crushed ice, and the kind of anger that had been building in a man named Derek Cole for the better part of the evening. The glass left his hand in a short, sharp arc, and it hit Clara Novick square in the chest. The tea exploded. Ice scattered across the floor. The sound of it hitting the tile was sharp and clean, like a small crack of thunder in the middle of a quiet room. Clara stood completely still. Her white uniform shirt was soaked through in an instant. Her notepad was still in her hand. She had not dropped it. Her pen was still tucked behind her ear. She had not flinched. But her eyes, those careful, steady, green eyes, had gone wide for just one moment, just long enough for anyone watching to understand that she had not expected it, and that it had hurt, not just the cold of the ice, not just the sting of the liquid against her skin, but the part of it that had nothing to do with the glass at all. She was 27 years old. She had worked the dinner shift at Milo's Diner for 3 years. She knew every regular by name, knew which tables wobbled, knew which booth had a draft from the back door in winter. She had handled rude customers before. She had handled men who clicked their fingers at her, men who sent food back for no good reason, men who looked through her like she was part of the furniture. But she had never had a drink thrown at her. Not until tonight. Derek Cole was not a regular. He had come in just after 9 o'clock with 2 other men, both of them quieter than him, both of them carrying the look of people who had long ago learned it was easier to let Derek do whatever Derek wanted than to slow him down. He was a big man, wide across the shoulders, with a thick neck and a face that looked like it had been in a few arguments and had not always come out on top. He was not dressed badly. He wore a clean shirt, dark jeans, and a watch that caught the light when he moved his wrist. But none of that covered what he was underneath, which was a man who had been drinking before he arrived and who had come looking for a place to keep going. From the moment he sat down, the energy around his table changed the room. It was not loud at first. It started with the way he talked to Clara when she came to take their order. He did not look at her. He spoke to the table or to his friends as if she were a speaker in the ceiling that he was directing his voice toward rather than a person standing 2 feet away from him. He ordered a burger, extra pickles, and sweet tea, and when she repeated the order back to him to confirm it, he said, without looking up, "Yeah, I heard you the first time." His friends said nothing. Clara wrote the order down and walked to the kitchen. The diner was not large. It had 14 tables, a long counter with 8 stools, a kitchen at the back with a window through which the cooks could slide plates when orders were ready, and a front wall that was mostly glass, looking out onto a street that was quiet at that hour. The booths along the windows had cracked red vinyl seats. The floor was black and white tile, scuffed with years of foot traffic and chair legs. The overhead lights were warm, the kind that made the whole place look slightly golden in the evenings. There was a jukebox in the corner that nobody had put money in for years, but it was still there, and it still looked like it belonged. It was the kind of place that had been around long enough to feel permanent. It smelled like coffee and griddle oil, and the faint sweetness of pie that had been warming in a display case by the register all day. There were framed photographs on the walls, old ones, of the street outside taken decades ago, of people who had eaten there in the years before Clara was born. Milo himself was behind the counter. He was 61, short, with gray hair, and a habit of wiping down the counter with a cloth even when the counter was already clean. He had owned the diner for 19 years. He had seen most things a diner could show a man. He had watched marriages fall apart over coffee cups and watched families come back together over plates of eggs. He knew his regulars the way a person knows the furniture of their own home, not by thinking about it, but by feel. He noticed Derek Cole the moment the man walked in. He did not say anything, he just watched and kept wiping the counter. There were 9 other people in the diner that night. A man named Arthur who sat at the end of the counter every Tuesday with a crossword puzzle and a black coffee. A young couple in the booth by the window who had been talking quietly and laughing softly for the past hour. A woman named Gloria who was on her third cup of tea and had a stack of papers in front of her that she kept reading and rereading. Two men in work clothes near the back who ate without talking, the comfortable silence of people who had known each other long enough to not need words. And in the far corner, alone in a booth, a man who had been there before any of them. He had a cup of coffee and a slice of cherry pie. He had not spoken since he ordered. He had not looked up from the table. He was perhaps 60, perhaps older, with silver hair that was neatly kept and a dark jacket that fit him the way expensive things fit people who have worn expensive things for a long time. He sat with a stillness that was different from the stillness of someone waiting. It was the stillness of someone who had nowhere to be and no need to prove it. Clara had brought him his coffee and his pie without a word, because he had asked for exactly that when he arrived. "Coffee, cherry pie, and I'd appreciate the quiet," he had said, not rudely, just simply, like a man who had learned that the clearest way to get what you want is to say exactly what it is. His name was Vincent Carr. Nobody in the diner knew that yet. Derek Cole's food arrived 12 minutes after he ordered it, which was fast for a Tuesday night, and he pushed the plate away after one bite and told Clara that the burger was cold. Clara touched the edge of the bun. It was warm. She said politely that she could take it back if he liked, but that it had just come off the grill. Derek looked at her for the first time all evening. "I didn't ask for your opinion," he said. One of his friends looked at the table. The other picked up his phone. Clara took the plate to the kitchen. She told the cook, a steady man named Pete who had worked the grill for 11 years and had heard everything, that the customer thought the burger was cold. Pete said nothing, put the burger on the grill for 90 seconds, plated it again, and slid it back through the window. Clara carried it back to the table. Derek said it tasted like rubber now. Clara said she was sorry to hear that, and asked if she could bring him something else. He said no. He said he would eat it, but he wanted to make sure she knew it was not good. She said she understood, wrote nothing, and moved to check on the couple by the window. 20 minutes passed. The diner stayed quiet. Derek and his friends ate mostly in silence, though Derek made a comment every few minutes, sometimes about the food, sometimes about the decor, sometimes about nothing in particular, just the steady low noise of a man who needed the room to know he was there. Then Clara came to refill his tea. She reached across the table with the pitcher, and as she did, her elbow caught the edge of his glass, not hard, barely more than a nudge, and the glass shifted 2 inches across the table. Nothing spilled. She caught it. She set it back upright, said sorry about that, and began to pour. Derek sat forward. "You almost knocked that right off the table," he said. "I'm sorry," Clara said again. "It didn't spill." "That's not the point," he said. He said it slowly, the way someone says something when they want you to understand that the actual words are not really the point either. You people never pay attention. You just walk around bumping into things and say sorry like that fixes it. You people. Those 2 words hung in the air for a second. Milo looked up from the counter. Arthur stopped writing in his crossword. Gloria lifted her eyes from her papers. Clara set the pitcher down on the edge of the table. She kept her face neutral, which was something she had practiced over 3 years of difficult shifts, and she said, "Can I get you anything else tonight?" Derek looked at her. Then he picked up his glass and threw it. Not at the wall, not at the floor, at her. The next 3 seconds happened in a silence that was so complete it felt physical. Clara stood there, soaked, holding her notepad, not moving. The ice was on the floor around her feet. The tea dripped from the hem of her shirt. The glass itself had not broken. It had bounced off the tile and come to rest near the leg of the next table, spinning slowly before it stopped. Derek sat back in his chair. "Clumsy," he said. It was the word he chose, as if she had done it to herself. And then Clara Novick did something that nobody in that diner forgot for a very long time. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She bent down slowly, picked up the glass from the floor, set it on the tray she had been carrying, and said, in a voice that was completely steady, "I'll get someone to clean that up." She walked to the kitchen. Behind her, the diner was absolutely silent. And in the corner booth, Vincent Carr set down his fork. Very carefully. Very slowly. The sound of it touching the edge of the plate was small, but in that silence, it was the loudest thing in the room. He did not look up. He did not move. But something in the way he set that fork down, something in the absolute, deliberate care of it, changed the feeling in the room in a way that nobody could have explained and nobody could have denied. Milo watched from behind the counter. He recognized that kind of stillness. He had seen it before, a long time ago, in a different city, in a very different kind of room. He had never forgotten it, and seeing it now in his diner on a quiet Tuesday night made him set down his cloth and stand completely still himself. Because a man who moves like that, a man who puts down a fork like that, is not a man who is about to do nothing. He is a man who is deciding. Clara did not cry in the kitchen. She had promised herself a long time ago that she would not cry at work, and it was a promise she had managed to keep through 3 years of difficult nights, rude customers, broken orders, and the low, grinding exhaustion that came from being on her feet for 8 hours straight. She had kept it through the night. A man spilled an entire pot of hot coffee and blamed her for standing too close. She had kept it through the evening. A group of teenagers had laughed openly at her hair. She had kept it through 100 small moments that people who have never worked a service job would never think to count as anything worth remembering. She kept it now. She stood at the sink behind the kitchen door and pressed a clean towel to her shirt. It did almost nothing. The tea had soaked straight through to her skin. She could feel the cold of it against her stomach, against her collarbone, and she breathed in slowly through her nose and out through her mouth, the way her mother had taught her to do when she was a child, and the world felt like it was pressing down on her from all sides. Pete, the cook, had seen her come through the door. He looked at her shirt. He looked at her face. He turned back to the grill without a word, reached under the counter, and set a clean folded towel on the edge of the pass-through window where she could reach it easily. That small thing, that simple gesture from a man who said nothing, nearly broke her composure more than anything Derek Cole had done. She pressed the towel to herself and breathed. She had 40 minutes left in her shift. She was going to finish it. Out in the diner, the silence that had fallen after the glass was thrown had not lifted. It had changed shape, which was almost worse. The people in the room were no longer frozen in shock. They were now very carefully doing ordinary things, looking at plates, looking at phones, looking at anything except the table where Derek Cole sat. It was the kind of deliberate not looking that is louder than starring, because it tells everyone in the room exactly where the problem is, while making sure nobody actually has to deal with it. Derek had not looked particularly troubled by what he had done. He had picked up the menu again, as if considering whether to order dessert. His friend on the left, a man named Owen, was looking out the window. Owen was 32, worked in a warehouse on the east side of the city, and had known Derek since they were teenagers. He was not a cruel person. He had just spent 20 years finding it easier to look the other way when Derek went past a line, because the alternative was an argument that Derek never let go of. Owen had a wife and a daughter at home. He wanted to be there. His other friend, a man named Gary, had put his phone face down on the table. Gary was looking at his food. He had not eaten anything in 10 minutes. Neither of them said a word to Derek. At the counter, Arthur had closed his crossword puzzle. He was a retired teacher, 68 years old, came to the diner every Tuesday without fail, always sat at the same stool, always had the same order. He had been coming here for 11 years. He knew Clara. He knew Milo. He had watched the girl grow from a nervous new hire into the most reliable person in the building. He was looking at the door to the kitchen now, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who deeply wanted to do the right thing and was not entirely sure what the right thing was. He looked at Milo. Milo had reached under the counter and had his hand on the phone. He was thinking. He had run through the options in the time it had taken for the glass to stop spinning on the floor. He could call the police. He could go over himself and tell Derek Cole to leave. He could wait and see if the situation settled on its own. 3 options. None of them clean. The police would take 20 minutes to arrive, and 20 minutes was a long time. Going over himself was a risk, because Derek was larger than him and was not in a stable state of mind. And waiting to see had already produced 1 thrown glass, so that particular option had already shown its ceiling. He was still thinking when he noticed the man in the corner booth. Vincent Carr had not moved since he put down his fork. He was sitting with both hands resting flat on the table in front of him, his coffee cup to his right, the half-eaten slice of cherry pie to his left. His eyes were still directed at the table. He had not turned to look at Derek. He had not turned to look at the kitchen door. He had simply gone very still in a way that Milo, who had grown up in a neighborhood where men like this were not uncommon, understood immediately. This was not the stillness of someone who had not noticed. This was the stillness of someone who was making a decision and taking the time to make it correctly. Milo let go of the phone. He was not sure why. It was instinct, partly. But partly it was something else, a kind of recognition, the way you recognize a sound you have not heard in years but whose meaning your body remembers before your mind does. He picked up his cloth and began wiping the counter again. Clara came back out of the kitchen. She had done what she could with the towel. Her shirt was still visibly wet, but she had smoothed her hair and she held herself the same way she always did, straight, steady, moving with the careful efficiency of someone who has work to finish and intends to finish it. She picked up a mop and a small bucket from the supply closet near the back and walked to the area in front of Derek's table and began cleaning up the spilled tea and the scattered ice. She did not look at Derek while she did it. Derek watched her. "You're slow," he said. She did not answer. "I said you're slow," he said again louder, as if she had not heard, as if the issue was volume. Clara finished mopping up the last of the ice, collected the bucket, and said, without looking at him, "Can I get any of you gentlemen anything else this evening?" The word gentleman was not sarcastic. She said it the same way she said everything, clearly and without decoration. But Owen flinched when she said it, just slightly, the way a person flinches when someone is kind to them in a moment when they know they do not deserve it. "Yeah," said Derek, "you can get me the check, and you can try to get that right at least." Clara wrote out the check, tore it from her pad, and set it face down on the edge of the table. She moved away. Gloria, the woman with the stack of papers, raised her hand for her own check. Clara went to her. Gloria pressed a 20 into Clara's hand and looked at her with the particular look that women give each other in moments when words would take too long. Clara folded the 20, put it in her apron pocket, and said, "Thank you, Gloria. You have a good night." "You too, sweetheart," Gloria said, and she said it like a person saying something they actually mean. At Derek's table, Owen had picked up the check and put cash down without counting it. He wanted to leave. He pushed his chair back. Gary stood up as well. Derek did not move. "Hold on," Derek said. Owen stopped. "She didn't bring me my change." Owen looked at the table. "You left cash, Derek. It covers it." "She doesn't know that," Derek said. He raised his hand and clicked his fingers in Clara's direction. The sound cut across the room like a small gunshot. "Hey, change." Clara was at the counter, 2 tables away, putting Gloria's check into the register. She heard it. Everyone heard it. She finished what she was doing, then walked over. "There's no change," she said. "The cash on the table more than covers the bill." "I want to see the math," Derek said. Owen put a hand on the back of his own chair. "Derek, come on." "I want to see the math," Derek said again. He looked at Clara. added up out loud. Clara looked at him for a moment, just a moment. Then she said in her steady, clear voice, the total of the bill and the amount of cash on the table and the difference between them. She said it without looking at her notepad. Derek sat back. "Huh," he said, "didn't think you could do that." "Is there anything else?" Clara asked. "Yeah," he said. He leaned forward slightly, his forearms on the table, and he looked at her the way some men look at people when they want the person to feel small. Not a stare exactly, more like an assessment. The kind of look that says, "I am deciding what you are worth, and the answer is not much. You should work on your attitude." The diner went so quiet that the hum of the refrigerator unit behind the counter was audible. Clara said nothing for 2 seconds, 1, 2, and then she said, "Thank you for coming in tonight." She turned and walked back to the counter. That was when Derek Cole stood up. Nobody had expected him to stand. He had seemed like he was done, like the evening was wrapping itself up on its own, like all of this was going to end the way most of these things end, with a rude man leaving and the people in the room collectively exhaling and going back to their lives. But Derek stood up, and the room immediately became a different room. He was bigger when he was standing. He was already a large man, but standing gave the size direction, gave it intention. He pushed his chair back hard enough that it scraped across the tile with a sound that was deeply unpleasant, and he walked around the table toward the counter where Clara was standing. Owen said, "Derek," just the name like a warning. Derek did not stop. Milo moved to the end of the counter, not quickly, but deliberately, placing himself closer to Clara without putting himself directly between them. He had the phone in his hand now. Derek stopped about 4 feet from Clara. He put both hands on the edge of the counter. "You want to say that again?" he said. Clara turned to face him. Her hands were at her sides. "Thank you for coming in," she said, exactly the same as before. It was not defiance. It was not bravery in the way people think of bravery, all fire and noise. It was something quieter and harder than that. It was the absolute refusal to be made smaller than she was, delivered without drama, without a raised voice, without anything that gave him something to push against. Derek Cole did not know what to do with that. He opened his mouth, closed it, his jaw tightened. And that was the moment. That was the exact moment when the man in the corner booth, the one with the silver hair and the dark jacket and the half-eaten cherry pie, the man who had been sitting in perfect stillness since he set down his fork, stood up. He did not stand up the way most people stand up from a booth. He did not slide out to the side, push himself up with his hands, the small awkward business of extracting oneself from a bench seat. He rose, and it was the only word for it, because there was a quality to the movement that made it seem like gravity had simply cooperated with him. He was standing, and then he buttoned the bottom button of his jacket, and he looked across the diner at Derek Cole. He did not say anything. Not yet. But every single person in that room felt it. The couple by the window had stopped talking and were looking at him. Arthur had turned on his stool. The 2 men in work clothes near the back had looked up from their plates for the first time all evening. Owen, who had been watching Derek, suddenly found his eyes pulled to the corner booth instead. Even Derek felt it. He turned. He looked at the man in the corner booth. For a moment, nothing happened. The 2 of them simply looked at each other across the length of the diner, and in that moment, without a single word being spoken, something was communicated that every person in the room received and understood perfectly, even if none of them could have put it into a sentence. The man in the corner booth began to walk. He did not walk fast. He did not walk with any obvious physical threat. He was simply a man of perhaps 60, silver-haired, well-dressed, walking across a diner with the unhurried confidence of someone who has walked into a great many rooms and has never once been the person who had to worry about who else was in them. He stopped 5 feet from Derek Cole. He looked at him with an expression that was not anger. It was not contempt. It was something much harder to read and for that reason, much harder to manage. It was assessment, pure and uncomplicated, the way a person looks at a thing they are deciding what to do with. And then he said, in a voice that was quiet enough that only the people nearest to him could hear every word, "Sit down." 2 words. Derek Cole stared at him. The man held his gaze without blinking, without shifting, without any of the physical signals that people use to telegraph uncertainty. And behind Derek at the counter, Milo watched this and let out a breath so slow and controlled it was barely a breath at all, and he set the phone down. Because the call was not going to be necessary. Not anymore. The 3 of them moved toward the door without ceremony. Owen held it open. Gary went through without looking back. Derek stopped for just a moment on the threshold, and everyone in the diner felt that pause, felt the room compress slightly around it, the way a room does when it is not yet sure whether a thing is truly finished or only finished for now. He did not turn around. The door closed behind them. Outside, through the long glass front wall of the diner, Clara could see the 3 of them on the pavement. Owen walking fast toward a car parked further along the street. Gary matching his pace. Derek in the middle, hands in his pockets, shoulders down, moving without the direction that anger gives a person and looking, from the inside of the diner where she stood, like a man who was unsure what he was walking toward. She watched them until they were out of the pool of streetlight. Then she looked back at the room. Milo was behind the counter. He had put the phone down. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, which was something, because she had worked for him for 3 years and had thought she had cataloged most of his expressions. It was the expression of a man who has just watched something resolve better than he feared it might, and who is not quite ready to return to ordinary speech. She nodded at him. He picked up his cloth. That was how they communicated, she and Milo. In the small signs, in the nods and the timing of gestures and the knowing when to speak and when to simply pick up a cloth. She went back to work. There were still tables to check and coffees to top up and the whole ordinary continuation of a Tuesday shift to complete, and she completed it, moving through the room with the same steady efficiency she always did, and the room moved with her, slowly exhaling back into the ordinary, slowly remembering that it was still, after all, a diner on a Tuesday night where people had come to eat and sit and be left in peace. Arthur had opened his crossword again. He was writing something in it, and the pen moved in the slow, considered way it moved when he was working through a clue that required real thought. He looked up when Clara passed and said, "Good night to you, Clara," and it was early for the good night. He had another 40 minutes at least by his usual pattern, but she understood what he meant by it. She poured his coffee. "Good night, Arthur," she said. Derek Cole was not a man who backed down easily. That was the thing about him. It was not even something he thought about consciously. It was simply the way he had always operated, the way he had moved through the world since he was 17 years old, and first discovered that being the loudest person in a room and the most willing to escalate could get him a long way in certain circles. He had never entirely learned that those same qualities had a ceiling, and that the ceiling could arrive without warning and in unexpected places. He looked at the man standing in front of him. He took in the silver hair, the dark jacket, the calm face. He registered that the man was older. Registered that the man was not physically imposing in any obvious way, not the kind of large that Derek automatically respected or feared. And he made a calculation in about 3 seconds, the kind of fast, instinctive calculation that people like Derek make without knowing they are making it, that told him this was a civilian, an older man, someone who should know better than to get involved. He decided to treat him that way. "Mind your business," Derek said. The man looked at him. He did not respond, not immediately. He simply held Derek's gaze for a moment that was several seconds longer than any normal social interaction would allow for, the kind of sustained, level eye contact that most people cannot maintain without flinching or filling the silence with something, a word, a gesture, a shift of the feet. The man did none of that. He was as still standing as he had been sitting. Then he said, "Sit down." Same two words, same quiet voice, exactly the same as the first time, as if Derek's response had not happened at all, as if it had simply not been a factor worth acknowledging. Something moved across Derek's face. It was quick and it was gone fast, but it was there. Something that was not quite irritation and not quite unease, but lived in the territory between the two. "Who are you?" Derek said. "Sit down," the man said again. Owen had taken 2 steps back from his chair. Gary had not moved at all. Both of them were watching the man in the dark jacket with an expression that was becoming increasingly difficult to describe as anything other than alarm, though neither of them would have been able to say exactly why. There was nothing in what the man had done that was obviously frightening. He had walked across a diner and said 2 words. That was all. And yet the alarm was there, quiet and growing, the way you sometimes sense weather changing before a single cloud appears in the sky. At the counter, the 2 men in work clothes had put down their forks. Neither of them reached for their phones. They watched without speaking. Arthur had turned all the way around on his stool. He was a man who had spent 40 years in classrooms, who had learned to read a room the way other people read books, and what he was reading right now was something he had not encountered in a very long time, if ever. He kept his hands on his knees and did not move. The couple in the window booth had gone completely silent. Milo stood behind his counter and watched. Derek Cole made a decision. He decided that this was going to go the way he chose because, in his experience, that was how things went when he decided they would. He squared his shoulders, set his jaw, and said, in a voice that he made deliberately loud enough for the whole room to hear, "You need to step back, old man. This doesn't involve you." The old man looked at him. "It involves me now," he said. There was a way he said the word now, not emphasized exactly, just placed, with the precision of someone who chooses their words the way a surgeon chooses instruments, not for drama but for function. Derek's left hand curled slightly at his side. And that was the moment when a man at the far end of the counter, a man who had been sitting there the entire evening over a cup of coffee and a plate of food that he had eaten slowly and quietly, simply stood up and turned around. Nobody had paid particular attention to him all evening. He was a man in his mid-40s, neither especially large nor especially small, with close-cut dark hair, and the kind of unremarkable face that a person forgets 30 seconds after looking at it. He wore a plain gray shirt and dark trousers. He had sat at the counter and eaten and drunk his coffee and had not spoken to anyone. He stood up. He did not move toward Derek. He did not speak. He simply stood, turned, and adjusted the collar of his shirt with one hand, a small, easy gesture, and then let his hands rest at his sides. But the way he did it, the way he stood, and the way he positioned himself, and the particular quality of his attention as it fixed on Derek Cole, was not the posture of a man who had stood up to stretch. It was the posture of a man who was now available, ready, waiting, as quietly and certainly as a door that has just been unlocked. Owen saw it first. He saw it, and something happened to his face, a rapid and involuntary rearrangement of every muscle in it. And he put his hand on Gary's arm without looking at him, and Gary looked at Owen's face, and then looked at the man by the counter, and then looked at the man in the dark jacket, and then looked at Derek and said, very quietly, "Derek." Derek glanced at Owen. He saw Owen's face. He looked at the man by the counter. Something shifted. It was the subtlest thing, a fraction of a change in the set of Derek's shoulders, something that lasted less than a second before his posture reassembled itself back into its default of aggression. But it had been there. Everyone who was watching had seen it. Gary leaned in toward Derek and said something in his ear. Just a few words, barely a whisper, He said them quickly and then pulled back, and his face, when he pulled back, was the face of a man who has just said something he did not enjoy saying and is now hopping very much that it is heard and acted upon. Derek went still. Not the stillness of the man in the dark jacket, which was whole and settled. This was a different kind of still, the kind that comes when a person's body catches up with information that their mind has not quite processed yet, the kind that happens in the half-second between understanding and response. He looked at the man in the dark jacket again. This time the look was different. This time it was not the look of a man measuring up a civilian. The calculation had changed, and Derek Cole was running it again, very quickly, and the result was not the same as before. The man in the dark jacket watched him do this. He waited. Then he pulled out the chair at the nearest empty table, the one directly to his right, and he set his hand on the back of it, not pointing at it, not gesturing toward it with any kind of demand, just resting his hand on the back of an empty chair, the way a person might do it in a completely ordinary conversation. "Sit down," he said, for the third time. Derek sat down. It was not a collapse. It was not a surrender with anything dramatic attached to it. He pulled the chair out further and sat in it, and he put his hands on the table in front of him, and he looked at the table. And the room, without anyone saying a single thing about it, understood that something fundamental had just changed in the arrangement of power within these four walls. The man in the dark jacket sat down across from him. He placed his own hands flat on the table, not in a threatening way, simply as a posture of presence, and he looked at Derek Cole steadily. And now, up close, for the first time, Derek could see the man's eyes clearly, and they were the kind of eyes that told a person they were being looked at by someone who had operated in situations far more serious than this one, and who had done so successfully, and for a very long time. "What is your name?" the man asked. Derek did not answer immediately. "I'm asking you your name," the man said. It was not louder, it was just cleaner, like a sentence with all the extra space taken out of it. "Derek," he said. "Derek," the man repeated. "My name is Vincent, and I want to have a short conversation with you, Derek, about what happened in this room tonight." Owen was still standing near his original chair. He could not leave. He understood, without anyone telling him, that leaving right now was not something he was going to do. Gary was standing beside him. Both of them were looking at the table. Vincent did not look at them. He kept his attention entirely on Derek. "You threw a drink at a young woman," Vincent said, "in a room full of people, because she bumped a glass that did not even fall." Derek's jaw was tight. He said nothing. "I want you to tell me," Vincent said, "what happened in your life that made you think that was an acceptable thing to do?" It was a remarkable thing to say. It was not what Derek had expected. It was not a threat. It was not a demand. It was a genuine, direct question, delivered in the tone of a man who actually expects an answer. And the strangeness of it, the sheer unexpected weight of it, did something to Derek that all the posturing and noise he had produced that evening had not managed to do to Clara. It made him feel ashamed. Not immediately. It moved through him slowly, like temperature changing in a room, but it was there. "She annoyed me," Derek said. It sounded, even to his own ears, like an insufficient explanation. "She annoyed you," Vincent said. He repeated it without mockery, without adding anything to it. Just held it in the air between them. Derek said nothing. Vincent leaned back slightly in the chair, not away from Derek, just settling. "I have spent a long time," Vincent said, "in rooms with difficult people, with people who were frightened and people who were angry, and people who were both at once, which is the most dangerous kind. And I have learned that a man who cannot manage his own temper in a diner on a Tuesday night is a man who has a problem that is going to follow him into every room he ever enters." He let that sit. "She did her job," Vincent said. "She did it better tonight under worse circumstances than most people manage under easy ones. and she deserved none of what you gave her." Durrock's hands were flat on the table. He was not looking at Vincent. He was looking somewhere between the table and the floor. "You are going to apologize to her," Vincent said. Durrock looked up. "You are going to stand up, walk to wherever she is, and you are going to apologize to her. Not because I am asking you. Because you are going to look at her and you are going to understand, maybe for the first time tonight, that she is a person, and that what you did to that person was wrong." The room was so quiet that the refrigerator hum had become the loudest thing in it. Then Vincent said, "And then we are going to sort out the rest." Durrock Cole looked at him. For a long moment, he looked at this man. This quiet, silver-haired, entirely certain man sitting across from him in a diner booth with his hands flat on the table and his eyes steady, and his voice completely level. And Durrock tried to find something to push back against and found nothing. There was no anger to meet, no threat to deflect, no bluster to outbluster. There was only a man who had looked at him clearly, said what was true, and was now waiting with all the patience in the world. "Okay," Durrock said. It came out smaller than he intended. Vincent nodded once. "Good," he said. The man at the end of the counter, the one who had stood and adjusted his collar, sat back down. He did so as quietly as he had risen, without a word, without acknowledgment from anyone, as if he had simply stood to better see the menu board and had now decided what he wanted and returned to his seat. The ease of it was the most unsettling part. The complete absence of anything that needed to be said or confirmed or resolved. He just sat and reached for his coffee, and the absence of ceremony in it was a language all by itself. Durrock was still looking at the table. Vincent sat across from him and waited. He was good at waiting. He had the quality of a person who does not experience silence as something requiring filling, who can sit in the gap between words and let it exist without discomfort. He had learned this, or perhaps he had always had it. It was hard to say. The things that become true of a person over enough years stop having obvious origins. They simply are. Owen was still standing. He had his jacket in his hand, had picked it up from the back of his chair at some point in the last few minutes without thinking about it, the way a person picks up the thing they arrived with when they sense they are close to leaving. He was looking at the back of Durrock's head. He wanted very much to leave. He had a daughter named Nora who was 5 years old, and she would have been asleep for 2 hours already. And his wife, whose name was Helen, would be awake in the chair by the television, waiting for the sound of his key in the door the way she always did when he went out with Durrock, because she had a wariness about Durrock that she expressed only in the timing of her wakefulness. He thought about Helen in the chair. He thought about Nora asleep. He held his jacket. Gary had sat back down, not in his original seat but in the seat nearest the door, as if positioning himself for the fastest possible exit when the moment came. He was a practical man, Gary, had always been. He sold building supplies for a living, had a measured way of looking at most things, and had spent the past hour looking at the ceiling and the floor in alternating turns while Durrock did what Durrock did, because the calculated decision of his early 20s that it was better to be around Durrock than not was a decision he revisited approximately once a month, and tonight was giving him strong and persuasive material to reconsider it with. He looked at his hands. Then he looked at the man in the dark jacket. He looked at the man for a long time, not with the frightened alertness of Owen, but with the measuring look of someone trying to understand a thing by its surfaces. The man sat with such complete and unconcerned authority that Gary found, after a while, that the looking itself was making him feel something that was not quite fear and not quite admiration, but existed in the narrow territory between them. He looked away. Vincent, across the table from Durrock, said, "You have people at home." It was not a question. Durrock looked up. "How do you know that?" he said. "Because every person who behaves the way you behave tonight is managing something they haven't found a better way to manage yet," Vincent said. And the ones who do it in public, in a room full of people, are usually carrying something from somewhere else entirely. It has nothing to do with the waitress, and somewhere, behind whatever you told yourself tonight, you know that. Durrock stared at him. So yes, Vincent said, you have people at home, and tonight they didn't see you at your best. It was the least dramatic thing a person could have said. It had no theatrical quality, no intended weight, but it landed with the particular heaviness of a truth that a person has been carrying slightly above the surface of their awareness for a long time, and that is now being acknowledged by a stranger who should not know it, and does. Durrock said nothing. His hands were flat on the table. Outside, a car passed on the street, its headlights briefly brightening the glass at the front of the diner, sending a sweep of light across the floor that moved and was gone. Clara was refilling the sugar holders at the far end of the counter when Durrock Cole came to find her. She heard him before she saw him. Not his footsteps, those were quiet enough, but the change in the room's attention. The subtle, collective shift of 9 sets of eyes moving in the same direction. She had been a waitress long enough to feel that kind of shift, the way sailors feel a change in wind, not by seeing it, but by everything else. She put down the sugar container and turned. Durrock was standing about 8 feet away. He was not moving toward her. He had stopped at what was, for a man his size, an almost deliberately respectful distance. His hands were at his sides. His shoulders, which had been squared and forward all evening, were dropped. He looked like a man wearing clothes that had become one size too large for him in the past 20 minutes. He did not look like the same person who had thrown a glass at her 40 minutes ago. She waited. "I want to apologize," he said. His voice was different. The amplitude was gone, that carrying, room-filling volume he had used all evening, as though the room were a stage and everyone in it were an audience he was performing for. What was left was his actual voice, lower, flatter, stripped of its performance. "What I did was wrong," he said. "I shouldn't have done it, I'm sorry." He was looking at her. Not through her, not past her, not at the table or the floor, but at her. Directly. And there was something in it that told her he was doing this as genuinely as he was capable of doing it in that moment, which was perhaps not as completely as a person should be, but was more than she had expected. Clara looked at him for a moment. She thought about a number of things in that moment, quickly and without drama. She thought about the cold of the tea hitting her chest. She thought about the sound of the glass spinning on the tile. She thought about saying nothing and walking away, which she had a right to do. She thought about saying something sharp and truthful that he had earned, and that she could deliver cleanly. She thought about her mother, who had once told her that the way a person accepts an apology says as much about them as the apology itself. "Thank you," Clara said. She said it simply, not warmly, not coldly, simply. An acknowledgement, not an absolution. She was not going to tell him it was fine because it was not fine, but she was not going to perform bitterness either because she had no interest in carrying it home with her. He nodded just once. Then he turned and walked back to where Vincent Cuh was standing, near the table where the conversation had happened. Vincent was upright now, jacket still buttoned, watching Durrock return with the same level expression he had maintained all evening. Owen and Gary were still standing near their original table. They had not moved toward the door. They seemed to understand instinctively that the conclusion of this evening was not something they were going to decide the timing of. Vincent looked at Derek when he returned. "Good," he said again. The same word he had said before, but it had a different weight now. It was not approval exactly. It was closer to acknowledgement, the recognition that a necessary thing had been done. He turned to look at Owen and Gary. They straightened slightly under the attention. "Are either of you driving?" Vincent asked. Owen said yes. "Then you'll take your friend home," Vincent said, "and I would suggest the 3 of you spend some time thinking about tonight." He did not expand on this. He did not explain what he meant or what the consequences of not thinking about tonight might look like. He left it there, clean and simple, and it was understood. Owen said, "Yes, sir." He said "sir" automatically, without thinking, and then registered what he had said and what it meant that he had said it, and he looked briefly at Gary, who was staring at the floor. Derek said nothing. He was standing slightly apart from his friends, his hands in his pockets now, and he was looking at the table surface of the booth nearest to him as if it were the most interesting thing in the room. Whatever had happened to him in the past 20 minutes, it was still working through him. You could see it, the way you see weather moving through an open landscape, slowly, in real time. Vincent let them stand there for another 3 seconds. Then he said, "You can go." They went. Owen held the door. Gary went first. Derek last. Derek paused at the door for just a moment and looked back at the room, not at any one person, just at the room, and then he pushed through the door and was gone, and the glass door swung shut behind them, and the small bell above it rang once, as it always did. The diner held its breath for a moment. And then Milo exhaled. It was the kind of exhale that comes after a very long time of not breathing properly, and several other people in the room did versions of the same thing, almost simultaneously, which produced a strange collective sound, like a building settling. The couple in the window booth looked at each other, and the woman pressed her lips together and shook her head slightly, not in disapproval, but in the particular speechless way that says, "I cannot believe what we just sat through." The man across from her reached over and put his hand over hers on the table. Arthur swiveled back to face the counter and placed his hand over his crossword puzzle. He did not open it. He just sat with his hand on it. Gloria, who had still not left, was looking at the corner booth with an expression of open curiosity. Vincent Carr had returned to his seat. He sat down, picked up his coffee cup, found it empty and set it back down. He looked at the cherry pie. Most of it was still there. He had set down his fork before he stood up and had not returned it to his hand since. He picked up the fork. Clara appeared beside the table with the coffee pot. She poured without being asked. He had not flagged her down. She had simply seen the empty cup from across the room and come to it, which was the small, instinctive service of someone who does her job by nature and not by instruction. "Thank you," Vincent said. "Of course," she said. She was about to step away when he said, "Are you all right?" She paused. It was such a direct question. People asked it so often without meaning it, and when they did mean it, it landed differently, like a hand on a shoulder versus a wave from across a room. "Yes," she said, "I've had worse nights." She said it with something that was almost a smile but was not quite one, more like the shape of one. Vincent looked at her steadily. "The way you handled yourself this evening," he said, "was more composed and more dignified than anything I have seen from twice your age. I wanted you to know that." She was quiet for a moment. "My mother worked in a diner like this one," she said. "She used to tell me that the way you carry yourself in the hardest moment is the only version of yourself that counts." "Your mother was a wise woman," Vincent said. "She was," Clara said. She moved away. Milo had come out from behind the counter. He walked to Vincent's table, which he rarely did with customers he did not know, and he stood at the edge of it and said, "Can I get you anything, sir? Anything at all? On the house?" Vincent looked at him. "Fresh slice of pie would be fine," he said. Milo nodded and went to the display case by the register and cut a fresh slice of cherry pie and brought it back himself on a white plate and set it down on the table, and Vincent thanked him. Milo stood there for an extra second. He was not a man who spoke about things that did not need to be spoken about. He had lived that way for a long time, and it had served him well. But he had a diner to run and people in it who came every week and trusted that it was a safe and decent place to sit, and someone had made that diner a different kind of place this evening for a while, and someone else had made it what it should be again, and that deserved to be recognized. "Thank you," Milo said. He said it as simply as Clara had said it to Derek, without decoration, like the truth which it was. Vincent picked up his fork. "Your girl was taking care of it herself," he said. "I just finished the sentence." Milo went back behind the counter. He looked at Arthur. Arthur looked at him. Something passed between them that did not require words, and Arthur picked up his pen and opened his crossword puzzle, and Milo picked up his cloth and began wiping down the counter, and the diner resumed its Tuesday evening rhythm in the way that things resume after something has moved through them, not exactly as before, but moving. Then the door opened again. It was not the three men. It was a man who came in most Fridays but occasionally on weekdays, a man named Philip who worked nights at a print shop 3 blocks away and came for coffee on his breaks. He came in and sat at the counter without looking around, because he had not been there for what happened and had no idea that anything had happened, and he said to Milo, "Usual please, Milo," and Milo said, "Coming right up, Phil." And that was the sound of the diner settling back into itself. What nobody in the room had seen yet, what they would only notice a short while later, was what had happened at all of the other tables. Vincent Carr had been sitting in his corner booth for the better part of 2 hours when he arrived. He had ordered his coffee and his pie and had sat quietly, disturbing no one, requiring nothing. At some point during the evening, before the trouble had started, he had gone to the register at the front and spoken briefly to Milo. He had paid every bill in the diner. Not in the showy, declared way of someone who wants a room's attention. He had gone quietly to the register, and he had found out what each table's check had come to, what they had ordered and what it totaled, and he had left cash that covered all of it, with a note that said, in plain handwriting, "For the room." And he had returned to his booth and sat down and said nothing about it. The people at the tables found out gradually and individually, in the natural course of the evening. The young couple reached for their wallets and were told their check had been handled. Gloria, who had already paid, looked at the counter and was told by Milo that he would make sure the overage went into Clara's tip. Arthur reached the end of his coffee and was told by Clara, who had found out from Milo, that his check had been settled, and Arthur put his hand flat on the counter for a moment and looked at it. The 2 men in work clothes got up to pay and were told the same thing, and the taller of the 2 looked around the diner slowly, trying to locate the source of this information in a face or a gesture, and found nothing in particular to look at except the ordinary room around him. Clara was the last to know. Milo told her, when she came behind the counter, to put an order through. He told her quietly, leaning close, and she stopped moving and looked at him, and he nodded, and she turned and looked at the corner booth. Vincent was eating his pie. He was not looking at her. He was not looking at anything in particular, just the middle distance that people look at when they are thinking about something private. She watched him for a moment. Then she went back to work, because she had 20 minutes left in her shift and 3 tables to finish seeing to, and because the best way she knew to honor a thing that mattered was to keep doing the work that mattered. But she looked at the corner booth every few minutes for the rest of the evening, just to confirm it was still there, that it was real, that a man had sat in that corner and done what he had done and continued to eat his pie as if it were a simple thing, a small thing, a Tuesday evening thing. Which perhaps to him it was. Which made it, to her, larger than anything she had words for. Philip, at the counter, drank his coffee and did not look up from his phone, which was how he spent most of his breaks, and which Milo respected entirely, because a man was entitled to the company of his own thoughts during a 10-minute break from a print shop. Clara brought him a refill without being asked. He thanked her and went back to his phone, and she went back to the register, and for the next 15 minutes the diner existed in a version of itself that was almost indistinguishable from any other Tuesday night, which was itself a kind of remarkable thing, considering what the previous hour had contained. She thought about the money in her apron pocket. She had not counted it. She had folded it and put it away in the same motion, and had not taken it out since, partly because she was still working and partly because she was not ready to know the number yet, because the number would make it concrete in a way that would require her to feel something larger than she currently had room for. She would count it when she got home. She would sit at her kitchen table, the small round one by the window that looked out onto the parking lot of her building, and she would count it under the lamp that gave out good light, and whatever it was, she would know what it meant. She knew already that it was generous. She had felt the weight of it when she folded it. She thought about what he had said, not because I am asking you to, not as an instruction, not as a condition attached to something else, for you, not for the house. She had worked in this diner for 3 years and had received 1,000 tips, some generous, some not, some forgotten in the same hour and some remembered for days. She had never received one that arrived with a sentence attached to it that changed what the money was. That made it something more specific than money. Something that had a direction, a sender, an intended recipient who was being singled out and acknowledged. She was not a person who cried easily. She was not crying now, but she was aware, in the way that you are sometimes aware of weather changing before any of the external signs have appeared, that something had shifted in the interior geography of the evening, and that she would be navigating by different landmarks on the drive home than the ones she had arrived by. Milo, who noticed most things in his diner without appearing to notice any of them, watched her move through the room for the next 15 minutes with the attention of a man who had known her since she was 24 years old and nervous, and dropping things in her first week, and who had watched her become steady and capable and good at her work, and who thought, standing at his counter on this Tuesday night, that she had always been worth more than what a Tuesday evening in a diner was likely to tell her. He was glad something had told her. He did not say this. He would not say it. It was not the kind of thing Milo said. But he thought it, and he held it alongside the 19 years of his diner and the 1,000 things this room had contained and produced and witnessed, and it felt right to him that it was part of the record now, even if the record existed only in the weight of the room itself. Philip finished his coffee at 10:15 and left with a wave. Clara cleared his cup and wiped the counter. The diner moved toward closing with the slow, comfortable inevitability of an evening that has run its full course. The last table was cleared at 10:43. Clara had done it the way she always did, efficiently and without fuss, stacking plates onto a tray, wiping the surface clean in 2 long strokes, resetting the salt and pepper and the small paper menu holder in its place. She did this every night without thinking about it. Muscle memory. The automatic competence of someone who has done a thing so many times it has become a part of how they occupy space. But tonight she was thinking about it. Tonight, every small, ordinary action felt like something she was doing consciously for the first time. Philip had finished his coffee and gone back to the print shop. The couple from the window booth had left half an hour ago, the woman stopping at the counter to say goodnight to Milo and glancing at Clara with a warmth that was not quite a smile but was more than a look. Gloria had left not long after. Arthur had sat at his stool until a few minutes past 10, finishing 3 more clues in his crossword, and then he had folded the paper neatly and tucked it under his arm and said, "Good night, Clara." "Good night, Milo," and gone out into the street. The 2 men in work clothes had left together, and the taller one had paused at the door and looked back at the corner booth one more time, the way a person looks at a thing they cannot fully explain to themselves, and then pulled the door open and walked out. Vincent Carr was still there. He had been there longer than any of them. He sat in the corner booth with his second cup of coffee cooling beside him, and he had done nothing dramatic, nothing requiring anyone's attention. He had eaten his pie. He had looked out the window at the street. He had sat in the particular way he had sat all evening, that comfortable, self-contained stillness that seemed to have no need of anything outside itself. Pete had gone out the back when the kitchen closed. He had said good-night to Clara through the pass-through window in the straightforward, spare way that Pete communicated everything, and she had said good-night to him. And then it was just Milo and Clara and the man in the corner booth and the quiet. Milo was beginning to stack the chairs on the tables nearest the door, which was his end-of-evening routine. He worked methodically from front to back, and he moved around the room with the slow precision of someone who has done this same set of movements in this same order for 19 years. Clara brought Vincent his check. She had written it out clearly, the same as she did for everyone. She set it at the edge of the table the way she always did, face down, unobtrusive. He looked at it. "I'm not sure this is right," he said. She said that she had not charged him for the second slice of pie. "Milo insisted," she added. Vincent looked at Milo across the room. Milo had his back to them and was lifting a chair with the practiced ease of a man who has done it 10,000 times, but he might have smiled slightly. It was hard to tell. Vincent reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He took out his wallet. It was plain leather, dark brown, worn smooth at the edges in the way that things worn every day become smooth after enough time. He took out several bills, folded them without counting them in any visible way, and placed them on top of the check. Then he took a business card from a slot in the wallet and held it for a moment. He set it on the table. He looked at Clara. "If you ever find yourself in a situation where you need something," he said, "anything at all, you call that number." She looked at the card. It had a name and a phone number, nothing else. No company, no title, no address. Just the name Vincent Carr, printed in simple black text, and a number that she did not recognize as belonging to any area code she knew. "I'll remember that," she said. "Good," he said. He pushed the bills across the table toward her. "That's for you, not for the house." She looked at the bills. She had been a waitress for 3 years, and she had developed, as all servers do, a fairly accurate ability to estimate a tip without counting it. What was on the table was not a tip. It was something else, a category for which she did not have a word, because it was too much to be called a tip, and not in the shape of a gift because it had been set down too matter-of-factly for a gift. She picked it up. She folded it and put it in her apron pocket. "Thank you," she said. "You've said that twice tonight under circumstances that didn't earn it," Vincent said. "This one you don't have to say." She looked at him. "My mother actually worked in a diner a lot like this one," she said. "Not this one. In a different city when I was growing up. She worked the dinner shift for 14 years, and I used to sit in the corner booth after school and do my homework while she worked, and I watched her. Every night. I watched how she talked to people, and I watched how she moved, and I watched how she handled the ones who tried to make her feel small." She paused. "I don't think she ever knew I was watching as closely as I was." Vincent was quiet for a moment. "I think she knew," he said. Clara smiled then. It was a real one, not the shape of one. It came up from somewhere and it stayed for a second, and then she took a breath and said, "You have a good night." She walked to the register. Vincent sat for another minute. He looked at his coffee cup. He finished what remained in it, which was not much. He looked out the window at the street, at the yellow light of the street lamps on the pavement, at the empty tables reflected in the glass. Then he buttoned the bottom button of his jacket and stood up. He was nearly at the door when Milo, who was stacking chairs 3 tables away, said without turning around, "You've been in before." It was not a question. Vincent stopped. "3 or 4 times," he said. "Long time ago." "I know," Milo said. He set a chair up on the nearest table and reached for the next one. "Used to come with a man named Eddie Farrow, Tuesday nights." A silence that had a particular texture to it. "You've got a good memory," Vincent said. "For some things," Milo said. He set the second chair up. He still had not turned around. "Eddie was a decent man." "He was," Vincent said. "Haven't seen him in a while." "No," Vincent said, "you wouldn't." Milo nodded at a table he was looking at. He reached for the next chair. "You don't need to worry about that one coming back," Vincent said. He said it plainly, without emphasis. not as a promise requiring acknowledgement, simply as information being left in a room. Or his friends. Milo set the chair down on the table. "Appreciate that," he said. "Good night, Milo." "Good night," Milo said. The door opened, and the small bell above it rang, and Vincent Carr went out into the street. Milo stood in the middle of his diner for a moment after the door closed. He looked at the room, at the tables with chairs beginning to go up on them, at the clean counter and the quiet kitchen and the girl at the register counting out her till for the night. He looked at the corner booth. He picked up his cloth. He went over to the corner booth and wiped it down, the same as all the others, the same slow 2 strokes across the surface. There was nothing unusual about the surface. It was a clean table in a diner, but he wiped it with the same care he gave to everything in the room, and then he straightened up and went back to stacking chairs. Clara finished counting her till. She pulled her jacket from the hook by the kitchen door, the one she always left there at the beginning of every shift. She said good night to Milo. He said, "Safe drive," which was what he said every night. She pushed out the front door. The street was quiet. It was nearly 11, and this part of the city was not much for late nights. There were street lamps every 40 feet, casting overlapping circles of yellow light on the pavement. Her car was across the street, a 7-year-old blue car that she had bought second-hand, and that had gotten her where she was going ever since. She stood on the pavement for a moment before crossing. She was not shaking. She had expected to feel the shaking once the adrenaline of the evening finished moving through her, the way she sometimes did after difficult shifts, the delayed trembling of a body catching up with what the mind had kept composed through necessity. But there was none. She felt tired. She felt the specific tiredness of a long shift that had asked more than the usual. But underneath that there was something else, something she turned over carefully as she stood there in the cool night air, trying to find the right word for it. She thought of the fork set down on the plate. She thought of the 2 words delivered 3 times across a room, each one landing with more precision than the last. She thought of a business card with nothing on it except a name and a number. She thought of a man who had paid every table in the diner and said nothing about it and gone back to his pie. She thought of what he had said to her, that she had carried herself with more composure and dignity than most people twice her age would manage in those circumstances. She had not let herself react to it when he said it, because there had still been work to do and a shift to finish, and she did not give herself over to things until she had the space to do it properly. She gave herself over to it now. She stood on the pavement outside Milo's diner on a Tuesday night, and she let herself feel what the evening had been, all of it, the cold shock of the thrown tea, the ice scattering across the floor, the terrible, deliberate humiliation in it, the sound of a fork set on a plate, the unhurried walk across a room, the particular quality of a voice that does not need volume to carry weight. The way an older man had looked at her and said, "The way you handled yourself this evening was more composed and more dignified than anything I have seen from twice your age." She was not going to cry about it, not because she was not moved by it, but because what she felt was too large and too complicated for crying. It was closer to gratitude, but not entirely that either. It was the feeling of being seen, not noticed, not observed, seen. There was a difference, and it was a difference she did not have a complete vocabulary for, but her body knew it, the same way her body had known the difference between the tea hitting her and what had come after the tea. She crossed the street. She got in her car. She sat in it for a moment without starting it, her hands in her lap, looking at the diner across the street through her windscreen. The lights were still on inside. She could see Milo moving between the tables, putting chairs up, doing what he did every night, what he would do again tomorrow night and the night after. She reached into her apron pocket. She took out the card. She looked at it in the light from the street lamp. Vincent Carr, a number, nothing else. She put it in the inner pocket of her jacket, in the pocket with the zip, the one she used for things she did not want to lose. She started the car. She drove home through quiet streets, and she did not turn on the radio because she wanted to think. And she thought about her mother, who had worked in a diner for 14 years and had never once let the work make her into less than what she was, and who had told her daughter that the way you carry yourself in the hardest moment is the only version of yourself that counts. Her mother had retired 2 years ago. She lived now in a small house in a town 2 hours away, and she called every Sunday and asked how the week had been. And Clara always told her it was fine, because it generally was, and because there was never very much that needed saying. But tonight there was something she wanted to say, and she thought she might call tomorrow morning instead of Sunday. And she thought she might tell her mother that a stranger had told her something tonight that she had been wanting to hear for a long time without knowing she was waiting for it. She thought she might tell her mother that someone had been watching and that it had mattered. She thought her mother would know exactly what she meant. The following day, the tables at Milo's were full by 5:30. Not unusually so, not packed in any way that looked deliberate, just steadily full, which on a Wednesday was a little more than normal. Arthur was there. Gloria came back, which she did not always do on a Wednesday. The couple from the window booth came back. The two men in work clothes sat at the counter instead of their usual table in the back, which they had never done before, but which seemed on this evening to feel right. Clara took their orders. She knew most of them by name. She brought the food when it was ready and refilled the coffees when they needed it, and moved through the room with the same steady efficiency she always did. Nobody said anything about the night before. Nobody needed to. But there was a different quality to the room that evening, something difficult to name but unmistakable once you had been there the night before and were back again now. It was the quality of a room where something had been tested and had held, where the ordinary was present not by default but by choice, by the decision of a room full of people to return to something because it was worth returning to. Milo noticed it around 6 o'clock, standing behind his counter and looking at his full tables. He picked up his cloth. He wiped down the counter. He did not say anything about what he noticed, because some things are better felt than named, better kept in the grain of a room than pulled out and held up for examination. But he kept it. He put it somewhere in the 19 years of this diner that he carried with him everywhere, in the weight of a place that had seen things and continued. And in the corner booth, the one where Vincent Carr had sat, there was a family eating dinner. 2 parents and a child of about 7, who had arranged her packets of sugar into a small pyramid on the table and was looking at it with great satisfaction. Nobody was sitting in the booth of someone with power, or the booth of a story, or the booth of anything other than an ordinary evening in a good diner on an ordinary street. Just a table. Just a corner. Just a place where a person could sit down and be left alone, or sit down and be looked after, or sit down and, if necessary, stand up for something that needed standing up for. The cherry pie was still in the display case by the register. Clara walked past it 17 times that evening. She never looked at it without thinking of the sound of a fork set very carefully against the edge of a plate. And every time, without meaning to, without being able to help it, she stood a little straighter.